In the harsh desert of 1847 Arizona Territory, Martha Sullivan never imagined her own family would trade her life for their safety. Her father and brothers handed her over to an Apache war band like livestock, believing they were sending her to certain death. They told themselves it was necessary, that one life could buy peace for their entire settlement. What they didn't expect was that she would survive. What they couldn't foresee was that she would find more honor, respect, and genuine family among the Apache than she ever knew in her own home. The warrior who claimed her, Aiyana, saw something in her pale eyes that reminded him of his own lost sister. Instead of a captive, she became his protected family. Instead of cruelty, she found kindness that would change both their worlds forever. But when Martha's blood family discovers she's not only alive, but thriving, will they accept the choice she's made, or will they destroy the new life she's built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sullivan homestead when Martha first noticed her father's hands trembling as he read from his worn leather Bible. Thomas Sullivan had built this place with his own calloused fingers, carved it from the unforgiving Arizona desert with nothing but determination and the promise of land ownership that had drawn so many families west. The adobe walls bore the scars of harsh summers and brutal winters, each crack telling the story of a family's stubborn refusal to surrender to the wilderness. Martha moved quietly through the small kitchen, her bare feet silent on the packed earth floor. At 19, she had grown into a woman whose gentle nature seemed almost out of place in this harsh frontier world. Her auburn hair caught the early light streaming through the single glass window her father had managed to transport intact across 1,000 miles of treacherous trail. She wore a simple cotton dress, faded from countless washings in the creek, and around her neck hung the silver cross that had belonged to her mother. The cross was all she had left of Catherine Sullivan, who had died bringing Martha's youngest brother into the world 3 years ago. Sometimes Martha would catch her father staring at that cross with an expression she couldn't quite read. Grief, certainly, but something else too. Something that made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't articulate. "Martha, child, come sit with your old father for a moment." Thomas's voice carried a weight that made her pause in her morning tasks. She had been preparing to check the chickens, to gather eggs and feed the few scraggly birds that somehow managed to survive in this desert climate. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron and settled into the rough wooden chair across from him. The Bible lay open between them, its pages yellow and soft from years of handling. Martha could see that he had been reading from Judges, the story of Jephthah and his terrible vow. The irony of that particular passage wouldn't become clear to her until much later. "Papa, you look troubled. Are you feeling poorly again?" Thomas Sullivan was not yet 50, but the frontier had aged him beyond his years. His once dark hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines etched themselves around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, the same pale blue as Martha's own, held secrets that had grown heavier with each passing season. "Martha, there are things a man must do to protect his family. Hard things, things that might seem cruel to those who don't understand the weight of responsibility." She reached across the small table and placed her hand over his. His skin felt cold despite the warming day, and those tremors continued to shake through his fingers. "Papa, you're frightening me. What's wrong?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness. Martha recognized the rhythm of her brothers' mounts returning from their dawn patrol. James and Samuel, 22 and 20 respectively, had taken on the responsibility of scouting the surrounding area for signs of Apache activity. It was a job that had consumed them both, turning what should have been the carefree years of young manhood into something harder and more desperate. The door swung open with more force than necessary, and James strode in with Samuel close behind. Both men bore the sun-weathered appearance of those who spent their lives outdoors, but there was something different in their expressions this morning, something that made Martha's stomach tighten with apprehension. "They're coming, Papa," James announced without preamble, Samuel spotted the smoke signals about an hour ago. They'll be here by midday. Thomas closed his eyes and nodded slowly, as if this news was expected rather than surprising. Martha looked between the three men, noting how none of them would meet her gaze directly. "Who's coming?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. "Apache," Samuel said quietly. "But not a war party. They're coming under a white flag." Martha had lived on this frontier long enough to understand what that meant. The Apache didn't approach settlements under truce flags for casual conversation. They came with specific purposes, usually involving negotiations that no one on either side particularly wanted to make. "They want to talk," Thomas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "about ending the raids, about finding a way to live in peace." The words should have brought relief, but something in her father's tone suggested otherwise. Martha had heard enough stories about Apache negotiations to know they rarely ended well for anyone involved. The Apache were known as fierce fighters, but they were also practical people. They understood that the endless cycle of raids and retaliation was bleeding both sides dry. "That's good news, isn't it?" Martha asked, though her voice lacked conviction. "If they want peace." James and Samuel exchanged a look that spoke volumes. In that silent communication between brothers, Martha caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. They had already discussed this situation without her, had already reached some kind of decision that involved her in ways she didn't yet understand. "Peace always comes with a price, daughter," Thomas said, finally opening his eyes to look at her directly. "The question is whether we're willing to pay it." The silver cross around her neck suddenly felt heavier, as if the weight of her mother's memory was pressing down on her chest. Martha touched it absently, a gesture that had become habit whenever she felt uncertain or afraid. Her mother had worn this cross through childbirth, through the difficult early years of homesteading, through the constant threat of disease and violence that marked frontier life. "What kind of price?" she asked. But even as the words left her mouth, Martha began to understand. The way her father couldn't look at her directly, the way her brothers stood positioned as if to block her escape from the room, the way the Bible lay open to the story of a man who had promised to sacrifice the first thing he saw upon returning from battle. The realization crept over her like ice water. Her family hadn't spent the morning discussing strategy for negotiations with the Apache. They had spent it discussing what they were willing to give up to secure peace. And somehow, impossibly, Martha herself had become part of that calculation. "Papa," she whispered, her hand instinctively tightening around the cross. "What have you done?" Thomas Sullivan finally looked at his daughter directly, and in his pale blue eyes she saw the terrible answer to her question. The Apache weren't just coming to negotiate. They were coming to collect on an agreement that had already been made. The morning sun continued to rise over the Sullivan homestead, but for Martha, the world had suddenly become much darker. The Bible lay open between them, its ancient words bearing witness to the kind of sacrifice that seemed to repeat itself across generations. In a few hours, she would learn exactly what price her father had agreed to pay for the promise of peace. The silver cross caught the light one more time as she sat in her childhood kitchen, surrounded by the three men who had raised her and were now preparing to give her away. Outside, the desert wind began to pick up, carrying with it the dust of approaching horses and the end of the only life Martha Sullivan had ever known. The Apache arrived exactly when James had predicted, their horses moving across the desert floor with the fluid grace of riders born to the saddle. Martha watched from the single window as the delegation approached, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. There were 5 of them, riding in a loose formation that spoke of both confidence and caution. The leader rode slightly ahead of the others, and even from a distance, Martha could see that he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps no more than 25, with long black hair that moved like silk in the desert wind. His horse, a magnificent paint stallion, responded to his slightest movement as if they shared a single mind. This had to be Aiyana, though Martha didn't yet know his name. She had heard whispers about him in the settlement, stories that painted him as both fearsome warrior and tactical genius. The other settlers spoke of him with the kind of grudging respect usually reserved for natural disasters, something powerful and dangerous that demanded acknowledgement even from one's enemies. "Martha, step away from the window," Thomas commanded, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. She didn't move. She couldn't. Something about the approaching rider held her attention in a way she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the way he sat his horse, straight-backed and alert, but not aggressive. Or perhaps it was simply that looking at him made this impossible situation feel more real than her father's halting explanations had managed to do. The Apache delegation stopped about 50 yards from the homestead, close enough for conversation, but far enough to demonstrate they weren't interested in violence. The leader dismounted with fluid grace and walked forward alone, leaving his weapons with his horse in a gesture that was clearly intended to show peaceful intent. Martha found herself studying his face as he approached. Even at this distance, she could see that he was handsome in the lean, angular way of men who lived their lives in motion. But there was something else in his bearing, a kind of controlled sadness that she recognized, because she carried something similar in her own heart. He stopped about 20 feet from the front door and called out in heavily accented but clear English, "Thomas Sullivan, I am Aiyana of the Chiricahua. We have come to complete our agreement." The words hit Martha like physical blows. Complete our agreement. Not negotiate an agreement or discuss terms for an agreement, but complete something that had already been decided. Her father had been negotiating with the Apache behind her back, and she was apparently the currency he had chosen to use. Thomas opened the door and stepped outside, his movements stiff with reluctance. James and Samuel flanked him on either side, their hands resting on their gun butts, in a gesture that was probably meant to look casual but fooled no one. Martha remained at the window, her face pressed against the glass as she tried to hear every word of the conversation that would determine her fate. "Aiyana," her father said, his voice carrying clearly in the dry air, "you honor us with your presence." The Apache warrior inclined his head slightly, a gesture that managed to be both respectful and somehow sardonic. "The honor is in keeping one's word, Thomas Sullivan, a thing that has become rare in dealings between our peoples." There was something in the way Aiyana pronounced her father's name, a careful precision that suggested English was not his first language, but that he had worked hard to master it. Martha found herself wondering about the circumstances that had led an Apache warrior to learn the language of his enemies with such fluency. "We are prepared to honor our agreement," Thomas said, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. "My daughter will come with you willingly, as we discussed." Willingly. The word echoed in Martha's mind with bitter irony. No one had asked her about her willingness to do anything. Her family had simply decided that her life was an acceptable price to pay for their safety, and now they expected her to participate in her own sacrifice with grace and dignity. Aiyana's dark eyes moved to the window where Martha stood, and for a moment their gazes met direct. She had expected to see cruelty or hunger in his expression, the look of a man claiming a prize. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like sympathy, as if he understood that she was as much a victim of this arrangement as anyone. "She watches," Aiyana observed, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been approval. "Good. A person should see the moment their life changes direction." "Martha," Thomas called without turning around, "come out here, daughter. It's time." The simple words carried the weight of finality. Time. As if her entire life up to this point had been merely preparation for this moment, this transaction between men who had decided her fate without consulting her wishes. Martha touched the silver cross one last time, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. Then she opened the door and stepped into the desert sunshine, her chin raised in defiance of the fear that threatened to paralyze her completely. The first thing she noticed was how much larger Aiyana seemed up close. He stood easily 6 feet tall with the kind of lean muscle that came from a lifetime of physical challenges. His skin was bronze from constant exposure to the sun, and his face bore small scars that spoke of battles survived and victories earned. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. They were dark brown, almost black, but they held depth that reminded her of still water at twilight. There was intelligence there, and something that looked like old pain carefully controlled. These were not the eyes of a savage or a brute. These were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and learned to carry the weight of difficult knowledge with dignity. "You are Martha Sullivan," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I am." Her voice came out steadier than she had expected, though her heart continued to race. Aiyana studied her face for a long moment, and Martha had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing things her own family had never bothered to notice. Finally, he nodded slowly, as if she had passed some kind of test she didn't know she was taking. "Your father has told you of our agreement." Martha glanced at Thomas, noting how he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "He has told me that I am to go with you. He has not told me why or what I can expect." Something that might have been respect flickered across Aiyana's features. "Honesty is a good beginning," he said. "Your father believes that giving you to us will purchase peace between his settlement and my people. He believes this because I allowed him to believe it." The words hung in the air like stones thrown into still water. Martha felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Allowed him to believe it? Peace cannot be purchased with a single life, even a willing one," Aiyana explained, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "Peace must be built day by day, choice by choice, between people who decide to trust each other despite good reasons not to. What your father has purchased is time. Time for both sides to discover whether such trust is possible." Martha absorbed this information, trying to understand what it meant for her personally. "And what happens to me during this time? You will live among my people. You will learn our ways as we learn something of yours. If the spirits are kind, you will find that honor and family can exist in forms you have not yet imagined." The way he spoke of honor and family struck something deep in Martha's chest. These concepts had been foreign to her experience with her own blood relatives, who had proven capable of trading her away like livestock when it suited their purposes. "And if I refuse to go?" Aiyana's expression didn't change, but she sensed that he had been expecting this question. "Then I will honor your choice and return to my people. The time your father hoped to purchase will be lost, and the cycles of raid and retaliation will continue until one side or the other lacks the strength to fight." It was not a threat, Martha realized. It was simply a statement of fact, presented without emotion or manipulation. The responsibility for the consequences would be hers to carry, but the choice itself remained hers to make. She looked at her father and brothers, noting how none of them seemed surprised by this turn of him. They had gambled her life on the hope that she would choose to sacrifice herself for their benefit, and they were prepared to let her carry the burden of that choice alone. "How long do I have to decide?" "The sun is directly overhead," Aiyana observed. "When it begins to move toward evening, I must have an answer." Martha nodded, understanding that she had perhaps 3 hours to make the most important decision of her life. 3 hours to choose between the family that had raised her and betrayed her and the unknown future represented by this enigmatic Apache warrior who spoke of honor and choice with equal conviction. As she stood in the desert sun, surrounded by the men who had shaped her life, Martha realized that for the first time in 19 years, she was truly free to choose her own path. The irony was that this freedom had come to her in the form of what everyone else saw as captivity. Martha spent the next 2 hours walking the boundaries of the only home she had ever known, her mind wrestling with a decision that would echo through generations. The homestead looked different now, smaller somehow, as if her father's betrayal had shrunk the very landscape around her. She found herself noticing things she had overlooked for years. the way the adobe walls were beginning to crack from the constant cycle of desert heat and cold, how the well her grandfather had dug was starting to run brackish. Martha set down her half-finished basket and looked at him directly. "I am trying to understand why you chose to bring me here, why you allowed my father to believe he was purchasing peace with my life." Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the small fire that burned between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully controlled. 3 winters ago, soldiers came to a peaceful Apache camp while the men were away hunting. They killed many women and children, including my youngest sister, who was 14 years old. Her name was Aiyana, and she had eyes the same color as yours. Martha felt her breath catch in her throat. She had heard stories about such attacks, usually described by white settlers as necessary actions against hostile savages. Hearing it from Aiyana's perspective, she understood that her people's heroes were someone else's monsters. "When your father approached us under a flag of truce, I saw an opportunity to save one young woman's life. Even though I could not save my sister's, perhaps that is not wisdom, but it felt like the right choice to make." The confession hung between them like a bridge built from shared pain. Martha understood now why Aiyana had looked at her with something like recognition when they first met. She was not just a peace offering or a captive. She was a chance for him to choose protection over revenge, creation over destruction. "I am sorry for your loss," Martha said quietly, "and I am grateful that you chose to honor your sister's memory through kindness rather than hatred." "Hatred is easy," Aiyana replied. "It requires no skill and teaches no wisdom. Kindness in the face of injustice requires strength that most people never develop." As the days turned into weeks, Martha found herself settling into Apache life with surprising ease. The physical demands of desert living, which had seemed daunting at first, became familiar routines that connected her more deeply to the natural world around her. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather or the presence of game. She learned to move through the landscape with the quiet efficiency that Apache people had perfected over generations of survival in harsh conditions. But the most significant changes were happening inside her own heart and mind. Living among people who measured worth by contribution rather than compliance, she began to discover strengths and capabilities she had never been allowed to develop in her previous life. She found that she had a natural aptitude for the kind of strategic thinking that Apache survival required, and that her questions about traditional practices were welcomed rather than discouraged. The breakthrough moment came during her 3rd week in the camp, when a young child fell seriously ill with fever. Martha had learned basic healing techniques from her mother, who had served as the closest thing to a doctor their isolated settlement possessed. When the traditional Apache remedies failed to break the child's fever, Martha suggested a combination of willow bark tea and cool water baths that her mother had used successfully. The treatment worked, and word spread quickly through the camp that the white woman possessed valuable healing knowledge. Suddenly Martha found herself consulted about various ailments and invited to learn traditional Apache healing techniques in exchange for sharing her own knowledge. "You have found your place among us," Cochetta observed one evening as they worked together preparing medicine for an elder suffering from joint pain. "Not because you have forgotten who you were, but because you have allowed who you were to become part of who you are becoming." Martha looked up from grinding herbs to meet the older Orma's wise eyes. "I feel more at home here than I ever did in the place where I was born. Home is where your gifts are valued and your heart is protected," Cochetta replied. "Blood makes relatives, but choice makes family." That night, as Martha lay beneath the desert stars listening to the night sounds that had become as familiar as lullabies, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She was no longer the Martha Sullivan who had been traded away by her father like livestock. She was becoming someone new, someone whose identity was rooted in conscious choice rather than accident of birth. The silver cross still hung around her neck, but its meaning had evolved. It no longer represented the faith of people who could justify betrayal with scripture. Instead, it had become a symbol of her own capacity to find grace in unexpected places and to create meaning from the raw materials of experience. Tomorrow would bring new lessons and new challenges, but Martha faced the future with confidence born from the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, among people who valued what she had to offer and who offered her the respect and protection her blood family had never bothered to provide. The photograph arrived on a morning when the desert air carried the promise of approaching autumn. Martha was grinding corn with Nasser, their conversation flowing easily between English and the Apache words she had been learning, when a commotion near the camp's edge drew their attention. A lone rider was approaching, but this was not one of their own warriors returning from a hunt. This was a white man, dusty and travel-worn, carrying something that glinted in the morning sun. Aiyana emerged from his wickiup with the fluid grace that Martha had learned to associate with moments of potential danger. His hand rested casually on the handle of his knife, but she could see the tension in his shoulders as he assessed the approaching stranger. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether this unexpected visitor brought peace or trouble. The rider stopped at the traditional distance for parley and raised his hands to show he carried no weapon. He called out in heavily accented Spanish that he came in peace, seeking to deliver a message to the white woman who lived among the Apache. Martha felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that somehow her previous life had found her in this place she had begun to think of as sanctuary. "I will speak with him," Martha said, rising from her place beside the metate. "No," Aiyana said firmly. "If he brings news from your former life, it comes through me first. You have earned the right to be protected from whatever poison your blood family might send." The protective tone in his voice touched something deep in Martha's chest. In all her years with the Sullivan family, no one had ever positioned themselves between her and potential harm. The gesture felt both foreign and deeply welcome. The messenger, as it turned out, was a Mexican trader named Rodolfo, who occasionally did business with both Apache bands and white settlements. He had been paid, he explained in his mixture of Spanish and broken English, to deliver an item to Martha Sullivan, with a message that she must decide whether to return to her family or face the consequences of her choice. "What kind of consequences?" Aiyana asked, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man prepared to defend what he valued. Rodolfo shrugged uncomfortably. "Señor, I deliver only what I am paid to deliver. The rest is not my business." He extended a small wrapped package, and Martha accepted it with hands that trembled slightly. The weight and shape felt familiar, and when she unwrapped the carefully protected contents, she gasped in recognition and dismay. It was a photograph, one of only 3 that had ever been taken of the Sullivan family. Martha remembered the day clearly, about 2 years before her mother's death, when a traveling photographer had passed through their settlement. The man had convinced her father to spend precious money on capturing the family's image, arguing that such photographs would become treasured heirlooms for future generations. But this particular photograph told a story that Martha had never fully understood until this moment. The image showed the Sullivan family arranged in front of their homestead, but it also showed something else that made Martha's blood run cold with understanding. In the background, partially visible behind her father's shoulder, stood a man Martha recognized as Colonel James Morrison, the cavalry officer responsible for numerous attacks on Apache settlements. He was in civilian clothes rather than his uniform, but Martha knew his face from wanted posters the Apache warriors had shown her. Morrison was supposed to be an enemy of settlers like her family, yet here he was, apparently comfortable enough in their home to be accidentally included in a family photograph. The implications hit Martha like physical blows. Her family hadn't simply made a desperate agreement with the Apache to trade her for peace. They had been playing both sides, working with the cavalry officer who had murdered Aiyana's sister while simultaneously negotiating with the Apache themselves. She had been betrayed not just by desperate people trying to survive, but by collaborators who had been actively participating in the violence that had torn the region apart. "What does this mean?" Aiyana asked, studying Martha's face rather than the photograph itself. Martha's voice came out barely above a whisper. "It means my family's betrayal was far worse than I understood. This man in the photograph is Colonel Morrison, the one your people call the child killer." Aiyana's face went perfectly still in the way she had learned meant he was containing emotions too dangerous to release without careful consideration. "The man who killed Ciala was a guest in your father's house. It appears." Martha stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this evidence with her memories of her father's anguished prayers and her brother's apparent desperation. They weren't just trying to save themselves, they were working with him. The silence that followed felt heavy with implications. Martha was only beginning to understand. If her family had been collaborating with Morrison, then her presence in the Apache camp wasn't just about securing peace. It was about having an informant, someone who could learn Apache secrets and report back to the cavalry. "They expect you to return with information," Aiyana said, his voice carefully neutral. "They believe you will honor blood ties over the bonds you have formed here." Martha looked around the camp that had become her home, at the people who had welcomed her and taught her and protected her. Then she looked at the photograph that revealed the ugly truth about the people who had raised her. The choice between her old life and her new one had never been clearer. "They are wrong," she said firmly. "Blood means nothing without honor, and they forfeited any claim to my loyalty when they chose to work with the man who murders children." Aiyana studied her face for a long moment, and Martha had the sense that this moment was a test more significant than any she had faced since arriving in the Apache camp. Finally, he nodded slowly and she saw something that looked like relief in his dark eyes. "Then we must decide what to do with this information," he said. "Your family's treachery changes many things." The tribal council convened that evening, and Martha found herself in the unprecedented position of being invited to participate in strategic discussions usually reserved for experienced warriors. The photograph had transformed her from a protected refugee into a valuable source of intelligence about enemy plans and capabilities. As the discussion unfolded around the central fire, Martha began to understand the broader implications of what her family had done. The peace negotiations had been a trap from the beginning, designed to locate the Apache camp and gather information about their numbers and defensive capabilities. Morrison had probably been planning an attack similar to the one that had killed Ciala, using Martha as his inside source. "They will expect an answer," observed Nalnish, studying the photograph with the careful attention of a military strategist. "If she does not return or send word, they will know their plan has failed. Then we give them an answer," Aiyana said, "but not the one they expect." Martha felt a chill of anticipation as she realized what he was suggesting. "You want to turn their trap against them. Morrison believes he is fighting savages without the intelligence or organization to mount sophisticated operations," Aiyana explained. "We can use that arrogance to our advantage." Over the next several hours, a plan began to take shape that was both elegant and ruthless in its simplicity. Martha would send word to her family that she was willing to provide information about Apache vulnerabilities, but the intelligence she provided would be carefully crafted to lead Morrison and his men into a trap of their own. The plan required Martha to play a role that felt like a betrayal of everything she had become over the past month. But she understood that sometimes the deepest loyalty required the most convincing deception. She would write letters describing fictional weaknesses in the Apache defenses and suggest attack routes that would actually lead the cavalry into positions where they could be surrounded and defeated. "Are you certain you can do this?" Etzel asked as Martha prepared to craft the first deceptive message. Pretending to betray people you have come to love requires a strength that can destroy the person who attempts it. Martha touched the silver cross at her throat, feeling its familiar weight, but understanding now that its meaning had evolved beyond anything her original faith could have encompassed. "I can do it because I know the difference between loyalty and betrayal now. My family taught me what betrayal looks like. You have all taught me what loyalty means. The letter she composed was a masterpiece of calculated deception, filled with just enough genuine details about Apache life to seem authentic, while containing strategic lies about defensive positions and patrol patterns. She described fictional supply shortages and exaggerated estimates of how many warriors were away from camp at any given time. As she wrote, Martha found herself thinking about the skills she had developed during her months with the Apache. She had learned to read the subtle signs of weather and terrain, to understand the complex relationships that governed tribal politics, and to see several moves ahead in the kind of strategic thinking that survival in the desert required. Her father had sold her to the Apache, believing she was weak and helpless, but she had discovered strengths he never bothered to recognize. When the letter was complete, Rodolfo agreed to carry it back to the Sullivan settlement for the same payment he had received for delivering the photograph. Martha watched him ride away into the desert morning, carrying with him the beginning of a plan that would either secure her chosen family's safety or destroy them all. That night, as she lay beneath the stars that had become as familiar as the walls of her childhood bedroom, Martha realized that she had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. She was no longer a white woman living among the Apache. She was an Apache woman who happened to have been born with pale skin and blue eyes. The transformation was complete, and there was no going back. The weeks following Martha's deceptive letter brought attention to the Apache camp that reminded her of the electric feeling in the air before a desert thunderstorm. Every warrior who returned from patrol brought news of increased cavalry activity in the region, and the careful network of scouts that Aiyana maintained reported growing numbers of soldiers moving through areas they had previously avoided. Martha found herself at the center of the camp's strategic planning in ways that would have been unimaginable during her first days among the Apache. Her knowledge of white military thinking and her ability to anticipate how Morrison might interpret the false information she had provided made her an invaluable advisor to the War Council. "They are taking the bait," Nalish observed one evening as he studied the latest scout report. "Morrison has moved 3 companies of cavalry to positions that match what your letter suggested would be our weak points." Martha nodded, though she felt no satisfaction in being proven right. "He believes Apache warriors think only about immediate tactics, not long-term strategy. He expects to find you scattered and vulnerable, easy targets for a quick strike. Instead, he will find himself surrounded in terrain that favors our way of fighting," Aiyana added, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a commander who had thought several moves ahead of his opponent. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Morrison's cavalry would be allowed to penetrate deep into what appeared to be vulnerable Apache territory, following false trails and misleading intelligence until they found themselves in a canyon with limited escape routes. Then, instead of the scattered and demoralized band they expected to encounter, they would face a coordinated force of Apache warriors, fighting from positions they had prepared in advance. But the plan's success depended on precise timing and Martha's ability to continue providing believable intelligence that would keep Morrison confident he was winning until it was too late for him to retreat. The psychological pressure of maintaining this deception, while knowing that lives hung in the balance of every word she wrote, was beginning to take its toll on her. "You look like a woman carrying the weight of too many difficult thoughts," Conchita observed one morning as Martha sat staring at a half-finished letter, her pen hovering uncertainly above the paper. "I am writing lies that I hope will save the lives of people I love," Martha replied. "But I cannot help remembering that the soldiers following those lies are someone else's sons and brothers, men who believe they are serving a righteous cause." Conchita settled beside her, her weathered hands folding calmly in her lap. "This is the burden of those who fight not from anger, but from love. Anger makes killing easy because it allows you to see your enemies as less than human. Love makes it harder because it requires you to remember that your enemies are human while still doing what must be done to protect your family." Martha looked up from her letter to meet the older woman's wise eyes, How do you carry such knowledge without it destroying your spirit? By remembering that the choice between love and anger is one you make every day. With every decision, the soldiers who follow Morrison have chosen to serve a man who murders children. We have chosen to defend children who would otherwise be murdered. The pain of making such choices is the price we pay for remaining human while doing inhuman things. The wisdom in Cochetta's words helped Martha finish the letter, though her hands trembled slightly as she sealed it with wax. This message would be the final piece of the trap, providing Morrison with what he would believe was the location of a secret Apache gathering where multiple bands would be vulnerable to a decisive attack. In reality, the gathering was real, but it was a war council where Apache leaders from across the region had come together to coordinate their response to Morrison's campaign of terror. Instead of finding defenseless women and children, the cavalry would encounter the largest gathering of Apache warriors assembled in over a decade. As Martha watched Rodolfo ride away with her latest deception, she felt the weight of Aiyana's grandfather's war lance, where it hung in its place of honor outside his wickiup. The weapon had been passed down through 3 generations of Apache leaders, and tomorrow it would be carried into battle against men who had been deceived by words Martha had written with her own hand. The war lance was a work of art, as much as a weapon, its shaft carved from mountain oak and decorated with eagle feathers and bands of silver that caught the light like captured starshine. But it was the symbols carved near the spearhead that held Martha's attention. They told the story of Apache resistance against those who would steal their lands and murder their families, each mark representing a battle fought and a victory earned through courage and sacrifice. My grandfather told me that this lance carries the spirits of all the warriors who died defending our people, Aiyana said, appearing beside Martha as she studied the ancient weapon. Tomorrow, I will carry those spirits into battle, and they will guide my hand as we end Morrison's campaign of murder. Martha turned to face him, noting the paint that decorated his cheeks and forehead in patterns that spoke of war and vengeance. He looked magnificent and terrible, every inch the warrior that white settlers described in their fearful stories. But she also saw the man who had chosen kindness over cruelty, who had honored his sister's memory by protecting rather than destroying. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Fear is a luxury I cannot afford tomorrow," Aiyana replied, "but I am concerned about leaving you and the others while most of our warriors are away. If something goes wrong, if Morrison suspects the trap and sends other forces to attack the camp." Martha reached out and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles beneath the war paint. "Nothing will go wrong. Morrison is too arrogant to suspect that he has been outmaneuvered by people he considers savages. He will walk into your trap because his hatred has made him blind to the possibility that we might be smarter than he is." The word "we" hung in the air between them, and Martha realized she had spoken it without conscious thought. Somewhere in the process of writing deceptive letters and planning military strategy, she had stopped thinking of herself as someone helping the Apache and started thinking of herself as Apache. "We," Aiyana repeated softly, and in that single word, Martha heard acceptance and belonging more complete than anything her blood family had ever offered her. That evening, as the warriors prepared for the next day's battle, Martha found herself involved in ceremonies she was only beginning to understand. She helped paint symbols of protection on young men who had never faced cavalry charges, and she listened to Nalish recite the names of Apache warriors who had died fighting similar battles in years. The ritual felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering a dream she had forgotten upon waking. She understood now that she had been searching her entire life for this feeling of being part of something larger than herself, something worthy of sacrifice and devotion. As the night deepened and the camp settled into the tense quiet that precedes battle, Martha made her own preparations. She gathered her medical supplies and prepared spaces where wounded warriors could be treated when they returned from the canyon, where Morrison's trap would spring closed around him. But her most important preparation was internal. Tomorrow would bring the final test of the choice she had made when she decided to leave her father's house. If the plan succeeded, she would be forever marked as a traitor to her own race in the eyes of white settlers. If it failed, she would likely die alongside the people who had become her true family. Either way, there would be no more pretending about where her loyalties lay. Tomorrow would strip away all illusions and reveal who Martha Sullivan had truly become in the months since her father traded her away like livestock. She was no longer the frightened girl who had watched Apache warriors approach her family's homestead. She was a woman who had found her strength in the desert wilderness, who had learned that family was chosen rather than inherited, and who was prepared to fight for the people who had shown her what honor and loyalty truly meant. Tomorrow would prove whether that transformation was strong enough to survive the fire of battle. The battle began at dawn in Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge 20 miles from the Apache camp, where generations of warriors had learned that terrain could be as powerful an ally as courage. Martha heard the distant sound of gunfire carried on the morning wind, a crackling rhythm that spoke of desperate men fighting for their lives in a place that offered no easy escape. She stood on a high ridge, overlooking the vast desert landscape, her pale blue eyes scanning the horizon for signs of smoke or dust that might indicate how the battle was progressing. Around her neck, the silver cross that had once represented her mother's simple faith now held a different meaning entirely. The Apache women had helped her incorporate small pieces of turquoise into the original design, creating something that honored both her past and her chosen future. The transformed cross had become a symbol of her own evolution, a tangible reminder that identities could be rebuilt rather than simply discarded. The silver still caught the light as it always had, but now it was accented with stones the color of desert sky, creating beauty from the combination of different traditions rather than the dominance of one over another. The waiting is always harder than the fighting, observed Itzel, who had climbed the ridge to stand beside Martha as they both strained to hear news from the distant canyon. Martha nodded, understanding now why warriors spoke of battle as a relief from the tension that preceded it. When you're fighting, at least you know what's happening. When you're waiting, your imagination creates every possible disaster. Aiyana will return, Itzel said with quiet confidence. He carries the spirits of his ancestors, and they have not guided our people through so many trials only to abandon us now. The certainty in her voice was comforting, but Martha had learned enough about warfare to know that courage and spiritual protection could not always overcome superior numbers and modern weapons. Morrison's cavalry was armed with repeating rifles and had been trained in the kind of coordinated tactics that had proven devastatingly effective against Apache fighters in other engagements. But this time was different. This time the Apache had advantages that Morrison couldn't have anticipated. They knew the terrain intimately. They had prepared their positions in advance, and most importantly, they knew exactly where their enemy was going to be and when he was going to be there. The trap Martha had helped design was based on her understanding of how white military commanders thought about Apache warfare. Morrison expected to face scattered groups of warriors fighting as individuals, using the hit-and-run tactics that had frustrated cavalry units throughout the Southwest. Instead, he would encounter something unprecedented, a coordinated Apache force fighting from prepared positions with unified command and careful strategic planning. As the morning wore on, Martha found herself thinking about the young cavalry soldiers who were dying in Devil's Canyon, men who had enlisted to serve their country and protect settlers like her own family. Some of them were probably no older than her brothers, farm boys and city clerks, who had joined the army seeking adventure or steady pay. The moral complexity of the situation weighed on her spirit like stones in her chest. These men were following orders from officers who viewed Apache people as obstacles to be eliminated rather than human beings with legitimate claims to their ancestral lands. But they were still human beings themselves, with mothers who worried about them and sweethearts who prayed for their safe return. "You are thinking about the soldiers who will not return to their families," Curchetta said, settling beside Martha on the rocky outcropping with the careful movements of someone whose joints carried the wisdom and pain of many years. "I am thinking about the choice between justice and mercy. Martha replied, and wondering if there are times when they cannot coexist. Justice without mercy becomes revenge. Concetta said thoughtfully, but mercy without justice becomes permission for evil to continue. The spirits gave us wisdom to know when each is appropriate, but they did not promise to make that knowledge easy to bear. The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a lone rider, approaching from the direction of Devil's Canyon. Martha's heart leaped with hope and fear as she recognized Takoda, one of the younger warriors who had ridden out with Aiyana before dawn. He was slumped in his saddle, clearly wounded, but his horse was moving at a steady pace that suggested the worst had not happened. Martha and the other women hurried down from the ridge to meet him as he reached the camp. Blood stained his shirt from a bullet wound in his shoulder, but his eyes were bright with the fierce joy of victory, rather than the dull pain of defeat. "It is finished," he announced, as willing hands helped him down from his horse. Morrison and his soldiers walked into our trap like blind men stumbling toward a cliff. Aiyana's plan worked perfectly. The relief that flooded through Martha was so intense it made her dizzy. She steadied herself against a nearby wickiup as Takoda continued his report between gulps of water and efforts to favor his injured shoulder. Morrison brought 3 companies of cavalry, just as we expected. They followed the false trails exactly as Martha's letters predicted they would, confident they were about to surprise a defenseless Apache camp. Instead, they found themselves surrounded in a canyon, with no escape routes. "How many casualties?" Nalnish asked, his weathered face grave with the knowledge that victory always came with a price. "Fewer than we feared," Takoda replied. "Morrison himself is dead, shot from his horse when he tried to rally his men for a charge that had no chance of success. Perhaps half his soldiers died with him. The others surrendered when they realized their situation was hopeless." Martha felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Morrison's death meant that the man responsible for murdering Aiyana's sister and countless other Apache women and children would never kill again. But it also meant that her deceptive letters had directly contributed to the death of human beings, a reality that would be part of her for the rest of her life. "What will happen to the survivors?" she asked. "That is for Aiyana to decide when he returns," Takoda said. "But I suspect they will be given the choice between returning to their posts with a message about the price of murdering Apache families or remaining in the desert forever." Over the next several hours, the surviving warriors began returning to camp in small groups, many bearing wounds but all carrying the satisfaction of a battle well fought and decisively won. Martha threw herself into the work of treating injuries, using skills she had learned from both her mother's frontier medicine and traditional Apache healing practices. As she cleaned wounds and applied herbal poultices, she found herself face to face with the human cost of the victory she had helped orchestrate. These were men she had come to know and respect, warriors who had risked their lives based partly on intelligence she had provided and strategies she had helped develop. The weight of that responsibility felt both terrifying and strangely appropriate. She was no longer an observer of Apache life, watching from the sidelines as others made the difficult decisions. She was a full participant, someone whose choices had direct consequences for the people she had come to love. When Aiyana finally returned as the sun was beginning its descent toward evening, Martha saw immediately that something fundamental had changed in him. He carried his grandfather's war lance with the easy confidence of someone who had proven himself worthy of the weapon's history, but there was something else in his bearing that spoke of burdens accepted and responsibilities embraced. He found Martha where she was tending to the last of the wounded warriors, her hands stained with blood and her traditional Apache dress torn from hours of crawling between makeshift beds to provide care where it was needed. "It is done," he said simply, settling beside her as she finished binding a warrior's injured leg. Martha looked up at him, noting the new lines around his eyes and the way he held himself like someone who had aged years in a single day. "Takoda told us about Morrison, sorry. It had to end that way. Morrison made his choice when he decided that Apache children were acceptable targets," Aiyana replied. "Today he learned that such choices have consequences. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sun paint the desert rocks in shades of gold and orange. Martha understood that this moment marked another transformation, not just for her but for both of them. They had proven that love could be as powerful a motivation for fighting as hatred, and that strategic thinking could overcome superior numbers and equipment when it was guided by justice rather than greed. "What happens now?" Martha asked. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had thought carefully about the future, rather than simply celebrating the victory of the moment. "Now we find out whether today's battle was an ending or a beginning, whether the death of one evil man is enough to purchase time for our people to build something better, or whether it simply means other evil men will take his place." Martha reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of a life spent fighting for survival and principle. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The word "together" held promises that neither of them had dared to speak aloud before this moment. They had been brought together by circumstance and betrayal, had found understanding across cultural divides, and had now proven their commitment to each other through the shared trial of warfare. As the desert night settled around them with its familiar sounds and comfortable darkness, Martha realized that she had finally found her true home, not in a place, but in the space between two hearts that had learned to beat in rhythm with each other, despite all the reasons they should have remained strangers. 3 months after the battle at Devil's Canyon, Martha stood in the center of the Apache camp, wearing a wedding blanket that told the story of two worlds becoming one. The women of the tribe had worked for weeks creating this masterpiece, weaving together symbols from both Apache and white traditions in patterns that had never existed before, but felt as ancient as the desert stones. The blanket was a work of art that would have been impossible without Martha's presence in the camp. Apache weavers had incorporated Christian symbols like doves and crosses, alongside traditional thunderbirds and mountain spirits, creating something entirely new while honoring the wisdom of both cultures. The central pattern showed two rivers flowing together to form a single, stronger current, an image that captured Martha's own journey from the Sullivan homestead to her place among Aiyana's people. "You look like a woman who has found her true name," Conchita observed, as she made final adjustments to the blanket's draping. "Not the name your first family gave you, but the name your spirit has been carrying all along." Martha smiled, understanding now what the older woman meant. The Apache had a custom of earning new names through significant life experiences, and while she would always carry Martha as a connection to her mother's memory, she had been given the name Aiyana's sister in honor of the young woman whose death had brought her and Aiyana together. The ceremony itself blended traditions in ways that would have shocked both Apache elders and white missionaries a generation earlier. Martha wore the silver cross that had belonged to her mother, but it was now permanently joined with Apache turquoise and mounted on a traditional beaded necklace. Aiyana carried his grandfather's war lance, but he had added a small piece of silver from Martha's original cross to the weapon's decorative bands. As the sun reached its zenith above the canyon where they had chosen to hold the ceremony, Martha found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a frightened young woman watching her father negotiate her life away like lives. Now she stood as an equal partner in a union that represented hope for understanding between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The ceremony began with Nalnish speaking words in Apache that traced the long history of their people's connection to this land. His voice carried the weight of generations of wisdom as he explained how the spirits of the mountains and deserts had guided the Apache through countless challenges, teaching them that survival required both strength and adaptability. Then, in a moment that would have been unthinkable under traditional Apache customs, Martha was invited to speak about her own spiritual journey. She had requested this addition to the ceremony, wanting to acknowledge publicly that her transformation from white captive to Apache family member had required more than simply learning new skills or customs. "When I first came to live among you," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air, "I thought I was losing everything that defined who I was. I thought that becoming Apache meant forgetting Martha Sullivan and the life I had known before." She paused, looking around at faces that had become as familiar and beloved as any blood relatives could ever be. "Instead, I learned that becoming Apache meant discovering who Martha Sullivan really was beneath all the limitations and expectations other people had placed on her. I learned that identity is not something you inherit, but something you create through the choices you make and the relationships you build." Aiyana stepped forward then, his own part in the ceremony requiring him to speak, not just about his intentions as a husband, but about his understanding of what their union meant for the future of both their peoples. "When I first agreed to accept Martha as part of our family, I thought I was saving one white woman's life to honor my sister's memory," he said, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had proven his wisdom in both war and peace. "Instead, I discovered that Martha was not a white woman living among Apache people. She was an Apache woman who happened to have been born into a white family." The words brought murmurs of approval from the gathered tribe members, many of whom had initially been skeptical about accepting a white captive as a permanent member of their community. Martha's behavior during the crisis with Morrison had proven her loyalty beyond any doubt, but more importantly, her daily interactions over many months had demonstrated that cultural identity was something that could be chosen rather than simply inherited. The actual marriage ritual involved the sharing of sacred corn mush from a traditional Apache wedding basket, but Martha had requested that they also include an adaptation of Christian communion using bread she had baked herself, according to her mother's recipe. The combination of traditions created something entirely new while honoring the spiritual heritage both she and Aiyana brought to their union. As they shared the ceremonial foods, Martha felt the weight of history settling around them, like a blanket woven from time itself. She was probably the first white woman to marry an Apache warrior in a ceremony that honored both traditions equally, and their children would carry the possibility of understanding between cultures that had been locked in conflict for generations. After the formal ceremony concluded, the celebration continued with dancing, storytelling, and the sharing of food that represented the abundance possible when different peoples chose cooperation over conflict. Martha found herself dancing to rhythms that had become as natural to her as breathing, wearing clothes that felt more authentic than anything she had owned in her previous life. But the most meaningful moment came near sunset, when she and Aiyana stepped away from the celebration to share a few quiet words in the place where they had first begun to understand each other as individuals rather than representatives of warring cultures. "Do you ever regret the choice you made?" Aiyana asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than insecurity. Martha considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked about her feelings regarding the dramatic changes in her life. "I regret that it took betrayal by my blood family to teach me what real family looks like. I regret that so many people had to die before we could find a way to live in peace. But I have never regretted choosing to build a life with people who value what I have to offer, rather than what I can be traded for." They stood together as the desert sunset painted the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real, watching their wedding guests continue the celebration that would go on long into the night. Martha knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, that their marriage was taking place in a world still marked by conflict and misunderstanding between their peoples. But she also knew that they had proven something important through their journey together. They had demonstrated that love could bridge cultural divides, that trust could be built even between supposed enemies, and that identity was flexible enough to accommodate growth and change without requiring the abandonment of everything that had come before. The wedding blanket that now belonged to both of them would hang in their wiki up as a reminder of the possibility of creating something beautiful from the combination of different traditions. Their children would grow up bilingual and bicultural, carrying the best of both worlds while being limited by the narrow thinking of neither. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Martha touched the silver cross that still hung around her neck, now permanently joined with Apache turquoise in a symbol of her own blended identity. She had traveled much farther than the physical distance between her father's homestead and Aiyana's camp. She had journeyed from victim to survivor to active participant in her own destiny. The transformation was complete, but Martha understood now that completion was not an ending. It was a foundation upon which to build whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that she had found her true family and her authentic self in the most unlikely of circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new adventures and new challenges, but she would face them as part of a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep understanding that could only develop between people who had chosen each other freely and completely.